Greetings to all and welcome to this new session of the Islamic History and Thought lecture series organized by the Institute of Ismaili Studies. As usual, I would like to remind you that the previous lectures of the series have been recorded and are now available on the IIS YouTube channel and also on the IIS website. So today I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Alexandrin, an associate professor of Islamic Studies in the Department of Religion, as well as a senior fellow at St. John's College at the University of Manitoba in Canada. Her first monograph is Abū Ya in the Fatimid Ismaili tradition, which was published in 2017, which I have here. And she's now co-editing a critical edition of Saad ad-Din Hamouye's Kitāb al-Mahbūb with Paul Balanfa, which will be published by Brill, and her current book project focuses on dreaming and sleeping in the 13th, 14th century Muslim societies, with a focus on Kubrawi Sufi works. So today's lecture will be focusing on the Ismaili side of Dr. Alexandrin's areas of interest. The lecture will last for about 30 to 45 minutes and will be followed by a discussion with Dr. Michele Petrone from the University of Napoli, L'Orientale, who kindly accepted to take part in this session. And I will be also discussing Dr. Alexandrin's lecture. Dr. Petrone is a specialist of Sufism and is also interested in Ethiopian Islam. He has published several academic articles on these topics. So during the lecture and discussion, the public is encouraged to send their questions in writing using the Q&A function at the bottom of the control panel. And as time allows, I will try to convey as much of your questions to the speaker. I will now give the floor to Dr. Elizabeth Alexandrin. Thank you for joining us.
Good day, everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. Gillon, for this gracious invitation and gracious introduction. And I'm really very much interested in presenting what was a long-standing question for me a while ago, and I look forward to comments, questions, and suggestions after presenting today. So, what is soul and what is soul's domain? In many respects, these two ideas formed one of the starting points of debates and discussions in the classical and medieval periods of Islamic intellectual history, especially in the works authored by scholars affiliated with the Fatimid Ismaili tradition. My talk today will focus on what Abū Ya al-Sijistānī presents in two of his works on Imaginal Motion as the domain of soul and soul world. Just as much as soul's movement is determining how natural time and natural motion arise, soul's activities shape and condition what is existing and coming into existence. In fact, in select works of Sijistānī, Imaginal Motion shapes the future to come. Sijistānī's coded symbolism in questioning time's timeline tells us much about the political and horizon event of the Kam's rising as pure soul, amongst other issues. After exploring the relationships between imaginal motion, resurrection, and time, my lecture today will offer some considerations of how in Sijistānī's subtle staging of Fatimid Ismaili doctrines of messianism and divine guidance, the apocalyptic plotline of returning to an original unity is suspended and the images of the end times cataclysmic events are displaced. In thinking about soul and soul world, my larger study involves how apocalyptic imaginaries inscribe borderlines. What is suggested by the apocalyptic, as grounded in Quranic discourses and interpretations? How did the extensive Ismaili lexicon of resurrection and ka'imology situate apocalyptic imaginaries in this expected future to come? Sijistānī's discussions of the end time resisted the messianic sovereignties implicit in 10th century Fatimid Ismaili thought, in particular as he introduced a ka'imology without specific reference to the Ismaili Imam. What is key to Sijistānī's understanding of the apocalyptic imaginary is his conception of the Qa'im as a process of istishfaf, prismatically rendering transparent the human form as the pure soul, nafsakia, ontologically mirroring transmigration of souls, i.e. metempsychosis or tanasuch. So my study today is employing specific passages from Sijistānī's works to present as well some of his ideas on the barzakh, many of which jolt conventionality, but lend familiarity in reading the Quran and Islamic traditions. The barzakh, occurring 3 times in Quran 23, verses 99, 100, as an intermediary borderline, or the thinnest line of separation, is correlated to the cyclical arising qua resurrection of the soul and the human form's perfection. Sijistānī makes the case that soul's remembrance is erased in soul's potential downward descent into other forms. In fact, with the cyclical timelines of resurrection and transmigration, potentially a collective generation of soul's remembrance is effaced. On these issues related to soul and soul world, as readers of Sijistānī, we might be held in suspense and left with many questions. So at the very beginning of my talk today, the 2 main takeaway points here. According to Sijistānī, the images of the end times violence and destruction are displaced through temporal reversals, where the souls of some remain monstrous and strange. Distinct others usher in a new creation as the final abode of pure knowledge, embodied by humanity under no law. So while some issues today will receive attention, others necessarily will remain unresolved even at the end of my talk today. In particular, what was Sijistānī's position on the identity of the Qa'im at the advent of Fatimid imperial sovereignty? So first, we're going to turn to some context. Historians have long been captivated by heresiographical accounts of the Persian school of Ismaili authors, but were limited in the extent they could trace this school's role in the Fatimid dynasty's history and vis-a-vis the rise of the Fatimid Empire. In turn, the extant sources pose questions both in theory and practice about messianic authority, ontologic political guidance, and imperial rule at a time when the Abbasid Caliphate struggled to maintain its secure governance over geographical expanses, often voiced in terms of dynastic and theological rivalries between empires. The historiography of the early Ismaili movements and the establishment of the Fatimid Empire in Cairo by the mid-10th century has often seemed to be a fragmented enterprise. From the 1960s onwards, several scholars pursued research on texts related to the so-called theology of Aristotle to address better the connections between Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and medieval Ismaili thought. Walker, a scholar who has contributed much to our knowledge of Sijistānī, regards 10th century Ismaili thinkers such as Nasafi and Sijistānī as proof positive for the simultaneous development of Neoplatonist philosophy and the emergence of Ismaili cosmology and doctrines on intellect and soul. In the case of medieval Ismaili thought, integrations of text and concepts from the theology of Aristotle in the longer form as suggested by Pines, Stern, and Zimmerman, and its tenets allowed for the subsequent development of a thought world that could successfully integrate the principles of philosophy with Quranic revelation. While not firmly established, scholars have suggested that in the works by Nasafi and Sijistānī, the subtlety of the parallel Quranic Amr, kun, be, with the Neoplatonist logos or nous, is most evident in discussions of the modes of acquiring knowledge. These parallel concepts likewise can be brought to bear on soul and resurrection, as I shall be addressing in this talk today. Now we're going to turn to some frameworks. So for implicit as well as explicit reasons, Sijistānī's works render obscure Ismaili doctrinal points and religious tenets within an elaborated Neoplatonist framework in ways that outweigh any sort of preliminary discussion of God's act of creation. Sijistāní's interpretive exercises hyperarticulate the continuity, stability, and endurance of ta'wil throughout the prophetic cycles until the advent or apparition of the Qa'im. Primary in importance to understanding the dynamic of ta'wil is that it marks the progress of the soul's potential perfection and humanity's cumulative perfection in terms of the dynamic and doubleness of first intellect and universal soul. Serving as one prime example is Kitāb al-Nabi, in Sijistāní's ta'wil of the Muslim testimony of faith, Shahada. The first issue is the concept of prophetic revelation in language. According to Sijistānī, it is of vital importance that the prophetic revelation takes on the qualities and characteristics of the spiritual and the corporeal domains for it to be intelligible and discernible. In this sense, prophetic revelation must acquire a composite form. The crafted and composite nature of prophetic revelation is such that it is inevitable that it possesses and acquires both the apparent, zahir, and the hidden, batin. What is revealing is likewise concealing. In another work, the Kitāb al-Iftikhār, Sijistāní's discussion of the application of ta'wil to specific Quranic verses includes recognizably doctrinal glosses, detailing the Ismaili theory of revelation's exoteric and esoteric aspects. It also includes different explanations for the necessities of the prophets and their heirs, the imams. In terms of the historical context and development of Ismaili doctrines, Sijistāní's works were not always in strict accordance with Fatimid understandings of interpretive authority. Fatimid legitimacy is by no means the central concern of the Kitāb al-Nabi or in fact Sijistāní's other works. Broadening again the scope of consideration, let us now turn to one of the main issues. Along with the theme of ta'wil, other central themes in Sijistāní's works, Bāth and Inbiāth. Sijistāní's works are concerned with the means by which the individual soul locates and obtains the complete understanding of revelation, purified of the elements of the physical world, subject to generation and corruption. So again, while some works highlight the distinctions between the interpretive process of ta'wil and the knowledge bestowed through divine support, ta'id, others such as Bāhirah and Iftikhār work with questions related to resurrection and the aforementioned istishfāf, which I will be talking about some more. In these regards, the central theme of Bāth and time before as well as after resurrection shift from the linear to the cyclical and the prismatic, remaining implicit and obscure on the figure of the Qa'im, i.e. Qa'imology as a major theme. So we now turn to this question of bridging creation and resurrection. So the sixth theme in Risālah al-Bāhirah is Bāth. Resurrection pertains to the soul. Soul is to be understood as the locus out of which arise all of the conditions and manifestations of end-time phenomena. That is, the natural phenomena that serve as signs and indications of the events preceding the final resurrection. What remains central to this current study's consideration of apocalyptic imaginaries is Sijistāní's use of the term in the verbal form, istashafa, yastashifu, lifting or raising of darkness. In the works of Ibn Sina, istashafa pertains not only to questions surrounding soul at the time of resurrection, but a range of other issues, such as optics and eschatology. It can be suggested here that Ibn Sina defines a discourse of imaginal resurrection and eschatology, grounded in an understanding of the faculties and the forms of soul's attachment to body, with a particular attention to rational souls' potential for attachment to the celestial spheres. This term related to imaginal potentiality complicates what Ibn Sina presented and resulted in multiple questions and refutations on the part of later thinkers. Briefly stated, Ibn Sina worked with this shared concern on resurrection to argue that it pertains to soul, as is seen in the 4th and 5th chapters of al-Tawiyah, in particular suggesting that there are two categories of soul/self and experiencing death and resurrection. Wahmi thus characterizes inner faculties, inner content, as well as forms of representation, definitions which carried over to the works of Ismaili authors and other Muslim thinkers. According to Ibn Sina, two categories of soul/self may be demarcated in terms of experiencing death and resurrection. Hasse has explored Ibn Sina's commentaries on soul, noting that it is possible that Ibn Sina was one of the first to discuss the content of mental states like hope and fear, often using the term intentionality, estimation for wahm. So in context, a quote from his work: sometimes in the course of remembering, some grief, anger, and sorrow arises which resembles the state of the soul at the time when the remembered thing was present. For the only reason of grief, anger, and sorrow about the past is the imprinting of this form in the interior of the senses. If the form returns, it produces this disposition or something similar. Wishes and expectations also produce this. Expectation is different from wishing because expectation is the imagination of something with a judgment or opinion that it probably will happen, while wishing is the imagination of something and desire for it, and the judgment that joy will ensue if it takes place. Fear is the opposite of expectation in the way of contradiction. Despair is its absence. These are all judgments of estimation. End of quote. How soul has perfected itself in bodily form and in the temporal world determines resurrection and afterlife experiences. Sijistānī's works present an ordering of movement and time that is imaginal, wahmi, wahmiya, especially for considerations of bāth, arising, with correlations to what Tariq Jaffer originally proposed as Ibn Sina's imaginal eschatology on the basis of his study of al-Tawiyah. Consequently, reading between these terms and concepts supports further how the process of istishfaf in minor and major cycles culminates in nafs zakiyah, the pure soul. This interest in subtle body arguments, which Ismaili authors understood to have been introduced in these works of Ibn Sina, based on Thabit ibn Qurra, culminate in a range of meanings as to soul, conceptions of soul, and individual soul, qua collective soul, arising as a nafs zakiyah, the pure soul. Therefore, bāth and inbiath are key to understanding the continuous motion of Sijistānī's epistemological frameworks, from alam al-nafsani, the duality and doubleness of universal intellect and soul, descends the human form, surat al-insan, as does ta'yid, divine assistance, and talim, instruction. The processes of bāth and inbiath, central to Sijistānī's works, bridge creation and resurrection. Sijistānī's engagement in theological metaphysics and ontology stages the form of the human being at the center of the spiritual world, as well as between two realms, the natural and the spiritual. Individual souls linked to bodies perform istishfaf. Like other things that come into being, the human being reflects the duality of intellect and soul. The world of soul receives the emanations of both intellect and soul at the level of individual souls, from which some receive a share of ta'yid and others, as Sijistānī explains, quote, render transparent, ma yustashifu, and occurs in individual souls from its own emanations. As a result, an acceptance of teaching, talim, and discipline, riyada, occurs through which souls possess life and attain their farthest ranks, end of quote. On the level of particular intellects and souls, The individual human being benefits from the mercy of the light spilling down and overflowing from God's command through first intellect. As the most noble of forms, which bears the seeds of first intellect and soul within it, the human being is, in fact, the primary recipient of the influences and benefits of Ta'yid in terms of the individual's ability to discern the relationship between quality and substance. We can say that there's a distinction that can be made, again, a philosophical distinction between Huwiya and Asiya on the basis of particular ideas of thingness and itness concerning originated existence. The existent has Huwiya when it is recognized through intellect, which points to origination and the originator. It is the knowledge of its originated nature and that it has an originator as a created existent. The knowledge of this is no more than a recognition of that as a fact. Originated existents are unique because they are created and they have a huwa, an originator. The Asiya are similar because they have identity, but no huwiya. So we can go on and on with these particular distinctions and philosophical discussions of these terms to see how they bear on Sijistānī's understanding ontologically of the soul's arising. As suggested by Hirji, in terms of thinking about soul world is within the form of the human being. It is the form that renders all forms, natural or soul-related, transparent. How the human form affects the sphere and is entailed in the sphere is as follows, and here we have a quote. If souls render the form of the sphere and its bodies transparent, while they are in a condition where the marks of nature have mastery over them, envy, ruination, and terrifying events are produced, which are the causes of perdition and destruction. But if souls render transparent the form of the sphere and all of its bodies and luminous stars in conditions where emanations of the intellect have mastery over them, then from their influences, good fortunate, divinely granted talents and beings who bring advantage and nobility are produced. So this particular set of examples from Bāhirah, in a way, provides a backstory and conceptual framework to the key arguments regarding the events and conditions of the end time and the arising of the Qiyamah according to Sijistānī. As in the Quran and prophetic traditions, Sijistānī approaches the questions about the events of the hour that result from, and another quote here, the arrogance of the antagonists and their mastery over the world, causing excesses and the increase of corruption in the land, such as murder, oppression, fornication, sodomy, and the corruption of language. Hence, their dirty and impure souls render forms of the structures of nature transparent, thus altering their fortunate position. From their influences, injurious and damaging deadly beings are produced, who make their barrenness and turpidity appear. From their influences, individual bodies are generated farthest from balance, making the character of predatory animals visible in the noblest of the organic domain, who is the human being. The arguments raised in paragraphs 9 and 10 of Bāhirah point out how God as creator would not annihilate wisdom, nor the signs of the ordering of his creation, as the determinants of creation, taqdir, exist in both creation and resurrection. In paragraph 16 of Bāhirah, Sijistānī turns again to debates between different groups on the question of resurrection. He maintains that the end time culminates in the completion of the human form arising as the qa'im rather than destruction. In other words, the raising of the qa'im represents a reversal of destruction. Endings bring forward and unroll or unfold all of the subtleties of light upon light. At the time that the pure soul appears, and with the apparition of the qa'im, pure knowledge will be manifest and all of humanity will embody this pure knowledge. In her study, Hirji has provided a really solid, in some sense, framework for considering by which means all of the prophets and messengers, as well as human beings, are catalysts of pure soul. Furthermore, Landolt had indicated in terms of iftikhar, quote, the individual souls that are adjoined to many individuals over long periods of time are said to be the vessels, marakib, of the pure soul, an-nafs zakiyya, and indeed the means, sabab, for its powerful appearance in a harmonious individual, shakhs mutadal, at the final stage of the universal process of prophetic mission. End of quote. From these perspectives, the tangibility of revelation and law result from the doubleness of intellect and soul. It is important to note that in many of his works, Sijistānī offers contextual approaches to revelation and law. More specifically in Bāhirah, revelation and law are extended until the time that these can be tested to be proven to be true, and so that individuals develop in their capacities to be part of the cycle that moves towards Qiyamah and the apparition of the Lord of the Rising, the Qa'im. So altogether, these passages give much weight to how Sijistānī explicates Bāth as prismatic at all levels, and with respect to the major and minor cycles of ascent and descent that pertain to both individual and universal soul. As Landolt has indicated, the Qa'im of the Lord of the Final Rising brings forth the conditions for the pure soul. And the aforementioned passage from Iftikhar is again very critical and crucial for thinking about what Sijistānī implicated via Bāth as arising. It lays out, in some sense, terms, differences as well between Sijistānī's works regarding universal soul and universal intellect, cosmologically speaking, and concerning a rapprochement towards this idea of the apparition of the Qa'im, giving additional insights into Sijistānī's use of the verb wahm. And in this particular instance, in terms of his understanding of prophethood, prophecy, revelation, Risālah, all of these things which frame this particular passage. Sijistānī raises soul, it seems, as the pure soul in the form of the human being in cycles of ascent and descent, but again, keeps obscure and complicates in many ways, to which degrees, i.e. at which levels of creation and resurrection, is intellect involved in the world of creation as it is and exists. All of these reasons behind why Sijistānī elevated soul potentially in this one treatise, Bāhirah, and as well, their significations for the horizon event of the Qa'im remain very obscure. So while we can look at particular works by Sijistānī, to look at another work, Kashf al-Mahjūb, while he does not mention the pure soul in particular in this work, he does point out that the resurrection the messengers have mentioned in their revealed texts is due to soul's influence. That is what appears via a pure soul, revealing what is to be revealed through intellectual emanations and virtues. The intellectual emanations and virtues function as signs in all of the preceding major and minor cycles, extending to the horizon event of the resurrection, benefiting or admonishing individual souls. What is rendered transparent, going back to this verb, istashifa, is the virtuous as well as the blameworthy. So it could also be suggested that Sijistānī touches upon crucial points with this either or signaling concerning what is being revealed and what remains concealed, qua the revelatory and the Sharia, the law, until the future time that is coming. Sijistānī states, from Bāhirah, consequently, ignorance worked upon them, washing away their splendor from them, and as a result, they were unable to accept the reward and the light from the Lord of Resurrection, end of quote. So it is a benefit at this particular juncture of my talk today to return again to Ibn Sina on resurrection and tanasukh, even if only briefly, to bring into sharper focus Sijistānī's points on apocalyptic imaginaries and borderlines, such as the barzakh. So Marmora and Jafar have addressed how separate souls are limited or finite, and why Ibn Sina claims that souls pre-exist the body. Regarding the barzakh, in Quran 23, verse 100, and from behind them is a barzakh to the day they are raised, which Sijistānī refers and alludes to in order to explain what the knowledge of the barzakhs are and mean, and how in each and every time souls are united to individual bodies. Sijistānī argues that the replacements are the forms of the departed ones, serving as the barzakhs, the souls being what are inherited from those who have departed. Ontologically and theologically, individual bāth arising for pure exalted souls pertains to the messengers, the Imam, the Qa'im, the Mahdi, were framed and construed prismatically. A nafs zakiyah, a pure soul, surfaces as a catalyst, as well as the medium of arising resurrection in the ascent towards Qiyamah and the rewards and punishments of the afterlife. So regarding this future to come, at the individual level of soul and thinking about universal soul, and with the arising of the Qa'im, we can also look at particular passages from other works of Sijistānī, which I've not given that much attention to, but I will mention one key idea. Again, thinking about the future to come, which substantially complicates the timelines here, complicating considerations of the timeline of creation and resurrection. Time in the celestial spheres are a determinant in the natural world, in that soul is producing this imaginal motion. Sijistānī views what can be termed imaginal time as well as imaginal motion as the domain of soul, and in the lower limits or ranks of soul's activities, just as much as it is determining how natural time and natural motion arise and are conditioning what is existing and coming into existence. This imaginal motion, which is the cause of time, pertains to soul, who remains capable nonetheless of receiving the benefits of the light of one God. So as we are turning now, just to some last points before conclusions here, regarding remembrances and inheritances in every community, whether pious and rightly guided or going astray. Sijistānī explains that their souls are connected like cords until the great resurrection and gathering. So at the end time, everyone will receive and be given what is due as retribution, the promise of amana. Greatly ambiguous, the line of demarcation in soul, as suggested by a particular set of passages in one of Sijistānī's works, may represent soul states. As we look at Bāhirah, he notes that he who has been strong in the knowledge of the barzakh has arrived at the right path and is not confused concerning the mode of reward and punishment to those from past centuries who have departed, whose traces have been wiped out and whose remembrances erased. So this fine line, the barzakh that Sijistānī refers to that may in fact be within soul, is tantamount to a borderline between potentiality and actualization of soul, from one form to the next, between one soul and another, in the collectivity of human souls across the generations, and between individual souls and the universal soul. So in conclusion, Sijistānī worked with the interpretations of set chapters and verses from the Quran as well as Islamic traditions, from which many scholars inferred the events prior to the end time will be cataclysmic, destructive, and apocalyptic. Rather, presenting the majority of his works, what we might call a critical exposition on a Neoplatonizing exercise of soul, Sijistānī maintains that in temporal suspensions, bridging creation and resurrection, individual souls, qua the human form, purify soul world, redeeming universal soul of its traces and multiplicities in its return to the abode of God's oneness. And as one last note on my talk today, and also linked to my larger study of these texts, so the sequence of terms on arising and resurrection introduced today, some of which were first discussed by Corban, remain open to debate as how to best translate them into English as well as French. This is due to the questions regarding phenomenological metaphysics and ontologies that informed and shaped Corban's original work in editing and translating some of Sijistānī's works, which have also left their traces. So for these reasons, and many others, sustained scholarship on Sijistānī's works, and in particular his lesser known works, remain a great ambition and desire. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alexandrin. I will now leave the floor to Michele Feltrone, and if anyone in the audience has any questions, please send them in writing with the Q&A button. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Fârès, and thank you, Elizabeth, because it was a fascinating talk, and I really feel unqualified looking what you said and because it will need a lot of discussion. But listening to you and rereading some passages of al-Sijistānī suggest me some parallels between the terminology used by Sijistānī specifically, especially the use of istishfaf and shafaf, and some passages of, in one case, Aristotle, and also Ibn Arabi. The parallel between Ismailis and Sufis is always complicated, because the idea of, well, this Ismaili thought influenced Sufism, and also the Aristotelian and Neoplatonic traditions, how much they influenced Sufism and how they entered Sufi thought. This is quite complicated, but my discourse is based on the fact that both Sijistānī, Ibn Arabi, and Sufis base their thought first of all on Quran, prophetic traditions, and for sure they were at least aware of Hellenistic and Greek ideas in a certain way. So it is quite difficult to trace at this stage of research a clear path that would connect Ismaili thought to Sufism, but some parallels, at least on a theoretical plan, can be designed. The first thing that came to my mind, and it comes from my studies with Professor Bafioni, who I think is here listening to us, is the diaphanous nature of the spheres as theorized and exposed by Aristotle, because this Aristotle says that diaphanous bodies are indefinite and transparent, and only thanks to the presence, the parousia of light, receive the color that then do not possess by themselves. Well, the term parousia here would suggest other kinds of speculations, but I will not take this direction. What is interesting is that there's a difference between what al-Sijistānī suggests and what Aristotle, at least in the Greek versions, suggests, that diaphanous bodies are the mushaffa by themselves. They're not acquiring. So there is no process of purification, which leads us to, in a certain way, to Ibn Arabi. There's in the Futuhat in chapter 340, which deals with, is focused on the figure of the first image of the Antichrist, the Dajjal, Ibn Sayyad or Sa'id, as it is reported in some traditions. So which curiously mirrors the figure of the Qa'im, alluded by Ibn Arabi, but it's just an allusion. Ibn Arabi uses the root shafafa in expressions like shafafa. It is quite frequent in the Futuhat and also in this chapter in the very same way as Aristotle did. But there is a passage about in chapter 340 that echoes the one about the soul rendering the form of the sphere transparent of al-Sijistānī. The passage is quite long, so it would require separate conference. I would just summarize it in a few lines before taking advantage of my position of discussant and submerge you with questions. But there are only 2 or 3, but I think they're quite dense. And the passage is about the Quran that descended upon the heart of Muhammad, but is transmitted in 2 ways. The first one is to the nafs natiqa, the speaking, logical, in the sense of logos, soul, by the heart. And only the second stage is the text made visible in the written form of the Mus'haf to the nafs natiqa through the help of the heart, which becomes the receptacle of the revelation and makes it visible. So only through this project. This happens only when shufuf and fadla ala al-jism al-murakkab al-katif, so the preeminence over the corporeal and composite body is manifested in the soul, allowing the soul to look into the heart as the locus manifestationis of the Quran itself. So this was quite striking to me because I have to admit that I searched for this route in the Futuhat because I remembered something, but this parallel is quite striking because it entails the very same process as al-Sijistānī. And on something, the chapter goes on discussing how this will influence also the changing of the Sharia according to the conditions of human being in different eras. Ibn Arabi does not talk about cycles of prophecy, but is saying the very same thing in different words. So just to come to my questions, the chapter deals also with the destiny of the believers and the unbelievers according to their capacity of receiving. Ibn Arabi uses the expression ta'id of God, which is Quranic, and so it's not surprising. But again, this parallel is quite. I think it will deserve some more inquiry. And also I won't go further in drawing this kind of parallels just because of time, and time will be the core of my questions, as Professor Alexandrin probably expected. First, about the relation between time and soul, because for Ibn Arabi too, time is wahmi, is imaginal, but he defines it in al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah as the result of a measure. We can measure time according to the motion of the spheres. The spheres move because of the soul, and the soul moves because of the presence of the first intellect in Ibn Arabi and in al-Sijistānī too. But one would like to ask Professor Alexandrin about the, is there any form of measuring of time in al-Sijistānī? Or the idea of time is just a direction before and after without the possibility of measuring it? And this brings to another theme which is dear to Sufis and to the discussion of al-Sijistānī too, which is qa'imology, or I would say in Sufis qutbology, or because the characteristics of the qutb and the qa'im are quite similar, especially for what regards time. The qutb, or the nafs al-zakiyah, or the perfect saint, is said to be sahib al-waqt or sahib al-zaman. And the appearance, disregarding for now maybe the appearance of Jesus at the end of times or the Mahdi, because this would overcomplicate the discussion. But if at the end of time or at the end of a time of a cycle, the time arises and restores everything, is this the moment of inversion? The moment of inversion for al-Sijistānī is in time or is outside time? Because this has enormous consequences on the doctrine of tanasukh, of transmigration. Because if it is in time, we have a transmigration in time. If it is not in time, or the beginning of a new counting and measuring of time, then it would be so much compatible with Sufi, especially Ibn Arabi's doctrine on hereafter and punishment in hell. And I'm considering that you have more acquaintance than I have with Ibn Arabi and this doctrine, so I'm not specifying a lot of things, but these are my two main questions about this point, and I hope I did not take too much time.
Not at all, Michele, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such great thoughts and comments and really great questions. And so we imagine in terms of time, so a circle with a dot underneath the 12. So this is a useful image in terms of thinking about what we see in many different mystical texts, Sufi texts, and in terms of Sijistānī, thinking about time and motion, as well as other issues. So on one level of perception, or from one perspective, so moving around on the clock face, up and down, going back to this 1 point, 12 o'clock. And it's quite interesting just to say some things about the points that you were raising when we think about Aristotle or particular philosophical texts and traditions. I would say probably from the 8th century of the Common Era up until the 14th century, when we think about different readers and audiences in urban centers, and we think about Islamic scholarship and non-Islamic scholarship. I could take the example of the curriculum of studying these philosophical works, such as Aristotle. And if we then think about that, I'm by no means an expert in any of this, but at one point, reading through the scholarship by Zimmerman and Stern and Poonawalla and Walker and Landolt and others, referring back to the so-called theology of Aristotle, and then also spending time with particular works by Sijistānī, especially Kashf al-Mahjūb, which in a way begins with the categories of Aristotle, to raise all these particular questions about time and space. And categories are very important for then going to these other issues, thinking about time and motion, thinking about origination and the originator and what is originated, and the substance of created things. And while I feel at this moment, as I have in the past, there are many things that are stated or presented ambiguously in Sijistānī's works. I think this question of bodies and spheres is of crucial importance to him as he works with particular ideas concerning the time to come and the appearance of the Qa'im. And I will note one thing, because you mentioned it before I try to answer the questions that you have so nicely articulated for all of us here. The idea of the diaphanous body of the Parousia. So for Sijistānī, in Kashf al-Mahjūb in particular, and if I remember correctly, we see some discussion of this idea that may have some resonance with Parousia in Qadi Numan. This is a question that is thinking about what are the presence of individuals within the Dawa. I guess I could put that in better words, but who are the individuals within the Dawa at the time, or at some point within this circling around the clock face that give the signs, that are showing the signs, and in some cases holding the liwa, the banners of the coming of the Qa'im and the Mahdi. And the more that I or other people, the more that we are like thinking about these particular questions that are raised by different Muslim thinkers, then we get a clearer sense of what is being mapped out in terms of apocalyptic ideas and what I like to call the malleability of messianisms within this time period and within Muslim societies. So any form of measuring in Sijistānī in terms of time as a direction, there are some passages of critical importance in Kitāb al-Maqālīd, which I did not go into today because I am at this point in reading things where I realize that I would need at least, I'll be very honest, like a good solid year to sit and think about everything that is in this one work, which has been beautifully edited by Poonawalla with a beautiful introduction. And so I think in terms of works that I feel I am more familiar with and comfortable with, there are some ways that Sijistānī thinks about time in terms of measuring in Kashf al-Mahjub. And that's where I feel, as of today, might change tomorrow, we get a good sense in what ways there are measurements that are visible and open to interpretation regarding historical time periods, cycles of prophecy, and the coming future time with the apparition of the Qa'im and the Lord of Resurrection. The second question. Yes, I would say from Bāhirah, and speaking more to Bāhirah than other works by Sijistānī. So if we're thinking about this ascent and descent, or inversion, or turning around or turning over, is it taking place within time or is it outside of time? So I would say that for Sijistānī, when he's discussing these particular issues in Bāhirah, the idea of time itself, if we're going to approach it conceptually as providing some kind of ontological framework, is both cyclical and prismatic. And one of the things that I think this does in terms of thinking about the whole range of different issues that he's raising in this particular treatise is it shifts the question of dimensionality substantially in terms of with time, without time, within space, outside of space. And it suggests in a way that I think is comprehensible to human beings, to all of us as individuals, that time is not what we think it is. And rather than saying, for example, that time is imaginal, Sijistānī is suggesting maybe on some kind of continuum that includes rotating and shifting spheres and cycles, which is also incorporating dimensionality, that it may be or it may not be within time. It may be beyond time. And I think as a strategy, as part of his strategy to remain ambiguous and obscure, and this is how he was thinking about the end time, and really, in some ways, trying to find his own position or standing place in terms of the idea of the Qa'im. Maybe there's, this may not be the right word to use, but maybe for Sijistānī, grappling with that key concept and thinking about it vis-a-vis Ismaili works from earlier time periods and thinking about the Fatimids and imperial sovereignties, maybe this was his way of both, taking a step back and then moving forward again to that particular issue. Another thing that I will mention, just in terms of thinking about Sufi texts, mystical texts, and some of the key Ismaili authors from the time of Sijistānī and onward. And, we can probably only go so far if I'm using terminology like sovereignties. And I always feel like I have to make apologies if I begin to sound too much like I'm speaking about Derrida or someone else. But this idea is obviously on everyone's mind. And in the case of Sijistānī, he again takes a step back from being too explicit about the the hierarchies entailed in these particular types of sovereignties associated with imamology, with the qa'im, as well as the spiritual hierarchies and the corporeal ranks that are really much more clearly presented in the works of other Ismaili authors. Yeah. But it's a discourse. From one last point here, so it's a discourse, this idea of walaya, or thinking about the kutub, or the qa'im, or the mahdi. It's a discourse that in and of itself is also showing itself to be very much shifting over time as different individuals approach it and begin to discuss it in their works.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Really, really thank you. And what you said about the malleability of apocalyptics is of an enormous relevance, not only for contemporary times, which taste like apocalyptic for many Muslims, but it is also interesting because this malleability, this flexibility, the possibility to use this discourse and bend it to diverse exigencies is gives us scholars the possibility to have an interesting ground of comparison. This is why I deem to compare Ismaili thought in Sijistānī with Ibn Arabi, because we are talking about end of times where all distinctions are effaced. And if I may ask just a single question, does a Sijistānī use the term Dahr in his works, and how he uses it? Because Ibn Arabi and the Akbarian school, but also before him, used Dahr, Ibn Barajam, for instance. Well, it is a name of God, but also it designates a kind of time that is not measurable, but still as a duration.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because my question at the time, I jotted down Dahr on the other page, so I forgot to mention it.
Yeah, it's yeah, definitely, it's very important. It's a very important term, and like in terms of thinking about, you know, verbal roots, and these are all really significant. And the mapping out within the different spheres and realms. Again, for Sijistānī in particular works, he gives that much more attention to think about its ways of measuring. And in many senses, I think what we see in Bāhirah gives more of a focus on this idea of like soul world and motion, and how that might be understood with dimensionality in, for example, al-Maqālīd, and also in Kitāb al-Nabi. This idea of thinking about the spheres, again, in relation to soul, but also thinking to what extent, if there is this duality between universal soul and universal intellect, do we see the presence of things from intellect to universal soul within these different spheres? Yes, I feel that might be a bit succinct, but you know how it is sometimes. A longer discussion is much needed.
Absolutely. I have the very same feeling that we need to discuss this point further, putting together other bits of texts from Sijistānī and other authors to define better the question, because it is of crucial importance.
Among the authors that need to be discussed in this dialogue that we're trying to establish between the Sijistānī and Ibn Arabi are also, well, I think Proclus actually, and his whole conception of time, which seems to me is directly, well, not just to me, I mean, but seems to have quite directly influenced al-Sijistānī, and his distinction of, at least if I remember correctly, 3 kinds of times, so to speak. I say so to speak because some of these times are not timely. They have no duration. But this notion that you just mentioned, Michele, the idea of a non-measurable time, but that still has a duration, this is what Proclus calls the aion, right? Which is specifically the time of the soul by contrast with the time of the physical and material world.
Yeah, it is from the side, seen from the side of Ibn Arabi, they have practically the same doctrine. When I started this kind of things, was much younger. I really regret not having access to Proclus at the moment, because it would have opened a lot of trajectories. But what you say is absolutely right and on point. It would be interesting to see what happens with al-Sijistānī and other Ismaili thinkers. What happens about this point?
The Maqālīd has several chapters dedicated
Really?
to this.
Really? I don't know, because I mean,
it's
so,
yeah, it's so true. So this is when we kind of think about the amount of work that can be done on these particular issues, like this would be a great and wonderful project for someone. And you know, when we start to look at particular Ismaili texts, and we think about this question of time or not time, or the different ways of thinking about measurement of time, and then link it back to all of the issues concerning soul and soul world. So yeah, Maqālīd is essential. And there are certain things written by Abu Hatim al-Razi that are also essential, some things from Kirmani and Nasr Khosrow. This is really a very distinct set of discussions that I'm curious to know, for example, whether or not we see the same within the treatises written by the Ikhwan al-Safa. So I've never braced myself for that intense exercise of going into the treatises to look at this question of time in particular. But now I'm thinking maybe it is time for me to do so.
Well, that would be an interesting journey, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's this whole you know, cyclic conception of time in the Ikhwan, and Godefroy de Calataï has extensively worked on this topic. So yeah. I was smiling earlier because you said that would be a work for someone, but you didn't say who. So am I sensing some reluctance here?
Well, it's like as we're having this very engaging and very interesting and fascinating discussion as we think about particular questions regarding soul and the diaphanous nature of bodies. And as Michele was mentioning, we think about particular discussions in Ibn Arabi, especially the reference you made to chapter 340, kind of thinking about the figuration of the Qa'im and the Dajjal, the Antichrist. So there's, yeah, a lot of work that I've been doing in relation to Abū Ya and his Kitāb al-Mahbūb, and then, you know, Dr. Balenfot and I afterwards are going to edit some of his short treatises on messianism. And, you know, there's there's always been, I think, in terms of like my larger like research questions, a question about form. It's something I return to again and again and think about, like, how are different authors thinking about the forms and the shapes of bodies, and how does that pertain to the end time and resurrection and apocalyptic thought. So
are you referring to the term surah or
yeah. So I think this is something that I've tried to keep my feet in the ocean, so to speak, and follow some of that, but not specifically on the question of time. No.
I mean, now you just mentioned a few themes. I mean, I feel like we're, turning, like circumambulating around a concept without naming it, which is docetism, right? This whole idea of istishfaf, the idea of the diaphanous bodies, even the idea that you mentioned at some point, I think it was from the Risālah al-Bāhirah, the fact that the Qa'im is named a shakhs, and this term has very strong implications in Shi and the Ghulat context, and the shakhs is not, I mean, can be a physical individual, but it can also be something else, like a more immaterial person. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts on the connection with docetic doctrine, or at least docetic temptations or inclinations?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's a really good point as well. I mean, referring to these different textual traditions. So we know, like, again, we're kind of thinking about some of the different scholars and colleagues who have written on these particular ideas of, so like, what is body, what is, body negating, what are the forms of body, so subtle body arguments, dream body arguments, resurrection bodies. So I don't really know, like in terms of thinking about the shared sources, don't really know at what point within specific circles of scholars from, let's say, the mid 8th century onward, these ideas might have been discussed in more detail. And I think in terms of my own work, I see this as like a very critical discussion that appears. And I think probably in terms of my own thinking and reflecting and reading of things, that maybe I've gravitated more towards trying to locate some of these ideas about body and form vis-a-vis medical tradition, and less in terms of theological texts. Yes, but I imagine that, again, from the perspective of the 21st century, like maybe I view this as an exercise in comprehension of what were shared discourses in late antiquity and in the early medieval period, rather than an archaeological exercise, if I can say that. But what were you thinking about in terms of this?
Well, I mean, I was just wondering if during your research on these works, if you meant something about the body of the Qa'im or the Imams, knowing that this is a theme that was widely discussed by later Ismaili authors of the Tayyibi tradition. So I was wondering if maybe something like that could have been found, could be found in al-Sijistānī's work.
So I would say like some of the original ideas of what we might call a prophetic anthropology, or thinking about the shaping of the form of the apparition of the Qa'im. So definitely in terms of my working very specifically with Ismaili texts. So there's a particular set of terms that are first introduced by Sijistānī, which in some ways for Kirmani, he feels a little bit a sense of discomfort, although he likes to think about this range of potential forms and shapes and figurations as they pertain to what I would call like his very strict and strictly articulated understanding of hierarchies. And then if we kind of think about the next turning point in this discussion of what is this form? What is this form, perfect form of the human being? Arising and appearing, making the apparition of the form of the Qa'im. I think this is something that al-Mu'ayyid fi Din al-Shirazi gives a great deal of attention to, where again, like Sijistānī, the ambiguity that he introduces is a, sorry, I'm in North American context, sort of a democratization of the form, if that might make sense, where it becomes a question of the collectivity arising and making the apparition of the form of the Qa'im at a particular time, at the completion and perfection of all the cycles. And so in al-Mu'ayyid, he gives great attention to all of the different possible discussions and distinctions about what people meant when they said form of the Qa'im, what is that? And, you know, of course, his use of sources is just, shall I say, breathtaking. And it's in really the majalis that I think a lot of these particular issues find grounding.
Thank you. Interesting. We have a question from Matthew Melvin Kushki, who says, I'll just read his message. Hi, Lisa, fabulous as always. Just a quick technical question regarding Wahm and the main engine of afterlife and next life experience. Fakhruddin Razi and his heirs book it also as the faculty responsible for making talismans work for investing matter with mind. Does Sijistānī make this connection too? And if so, perhaps we can speak of an Ismaili theory of talismanic reincarnation.
It's a great question. Well, it's a great question just in terms of thinking about also how things might be impressed or imprinted. And definitely Sijistānī gives that attention as a matter that needs to be discussed in relation to any type of form and material form. Does he use the word talisman specifically? I have a recollection that he might, but unfortunately I can't recall the specific passage from Kashf al-Mahjub, but there is a sense in that particular work as he's discussing different things and using particular examples to illustrate his arguments. Yeah, I wonder. That's a big question. I'm going to be thinking about it.
I mean, I had lots of other questions, regarding this wahm notion, which you translate by imaginal. What about khayal in this context? I mean, what I mean is that the term imaginal was like forged by a korban to translate khayal, and you're using it for wahm. So I wondered if you would comment on that. And I had another question regarding what you said about the actualization of the soul, the universal soul, if I understood correctly, with the manifestation of the Qa'im. So first of all, is this connected to noetics in the sense that the Qa'im brings forward the esoteric meaning of everything, of all religion, and this is equated to the actualization of the soul. So you can conclude that knowledge, true knowledge, constitutes the actualization of not only the universal soul but also the individual souls of the saved. So yeah, and then that will lead us to another point, which is the connection of the Qa'im with the asas or wasi, or the legatee in Shi'i and specifically Ismaili doctrine, since it seems that the Qa'im and the asas actually have the same function or the same role in this regard, except that they're not at the same moments of time, but noetically they have the same function.
Okay. Yes.
Sorry, that
yeah.
may
No, I was. So I was thinking again, like as we look at particular discussions in Sijistānī, and say, for example, we look at more specifically like Bāhirah, Iftikhār, and we look at terminology. We look at how Sijistānī is introducing particular ideas concerning Wahmiya, also in Kitāb al-Nabi, thinking about this term Wahmiya, thinking about it in its as a verb, as a quality, as an attribute, as something that might not be fully defined as estimation, but having this quality of some kind of form of like evaluation, where the evaluation or the estimation or the way of bringing things into representation potentially is erroneous for Sijistānī most of the time when he's thinking about what is entailed in Wahmi. The limitations of human faculties to perceive correctly and understand correctly when in the process of evaluating what something is. And of course, for Sijistānī, if I'm understanding what is in his works comprehensively, and then also in particular, this again for him is one of those critical issues that he's trying to figure out, I think, for himself. And in the larger cosmological structure of his worldview, so to speak, how the human being is engaged in perception and apprehension, imagining or estimating always has to be, in a sense, reappraised, reestablished in terms of what is quote unquote abiding in actuality in God's creation. And so it's almost as if Sijistānī is thinking about this as a process of dialogue between individual and anything that has a form and an appearance in the settings of, individual perception, comprehension, perception, and then that I would say is how to put it into words. It's a process of dialogue, I think, rather than thinking about it in terms of khayal, like imagination, as we might see in what was written by Korban, or how, for example, in terms of scholarship on Ibn Arabi, the idea of imagination is discussed and treated. And that in itself, I think if we kind of go from Sijistānī to Nasruddin Tusi, I think we can see again some of the same types of questions appearing about if I can't find the right English word for wahmi, that's okay. Like Tusi would probably say, I mean, let's give him some agency in the 21st century. He would probably say like, well, why would that be something that's an important quality or attribute for the individual who's engaging in these processes of apprehension and comprehension? And then for Tusi in particular, in terms of engaging in ta'wil of the Quran. And so it's possible that, if we use that perspective of Tusi on particular issues, then it can help to clarify things in terms of Sijistānī. Yeah. And yeah, the other two questions, I'm so sorry, maybe can you
sorry, yeah, it was just about this notion of actualization of soul, and whether so the Qa'im is responsible for this, or marks the moment of actualization of the universal soul, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, I think so.
So this has also noetic implications, right? So I was wondering how also if that's I mean, what is the relation between the asas or legatee and the imams, for that matter, and the Qa'im, since they both have this role?
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, there's I think when I was thinking about your question, I started thinking about sort of again this idea of the hierarchies. And so when we look at Maqālīd in particular, there's a range of different types of contrasts that he's making. Sorry, my voice is a little bit like scratchy now. So like, what are the things that are the range of meanings that are connected to the form of the Qa'im? I think that's one of the approaches that Sijistānī takes in terms of thinking about it as a noetic process. If we think about, for example, this form in relation to what is coming into potentiality and what is actualized, Sijistānī is like, again, a little bit ambiguous, because there's always this potentiality from rank to rank, where, for example, the asas is almost like showing again this doubleness. From one perspective, in actuality, Qa'im, in terms of perspective from the ground up, so to speak, from the lower ranks to the higher ranks. Potentiality. So the form acquires the range of meanings. But I think in terms of the noeticness of eschatology, then the final form becomes apparent to everyone.
Thank you. I think we will conclude our session here today. Thank you very much again, Dr. Alexandrin, for this wonderful talk and discussion. Thank you as well to Dr. Petrone for joining us today, and of course to the public. I would just like to announce the next lecture of the series, which will take place on the 9th of June at the same time, but the details will soon be uploaded on the IAS website. So this lecture will be delivered by Alex Matthews, who is a PhD candidate working on the Kitāb al-Fatarat, which is a Fatimid text attributed to Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman. So that would be end of 10th century. So as I said, the details and registration link will soon be uploaded on the IAS website. And the recording of today's session should be uploaded as well in the coming days, inshallah. Thank you again for your participation, and to the public, hopefully see you in June.